Is sex during menstruation sinful? Why were only certain writings of Paul included in the Bible? What habits or traditions did my wife and I keep while raising kids? Does 2 Timothy 1:18 support praying for the dead or post-mortem salvation? Do I believe in penal substitution? And many, many other questions that I'm going to address on this special bonus, now bi-monthly bonus Q&A episode. If you want to become part of the Theology Raw community and gain access to be able to ask questions during these bi-monthly episodes, you can go to patreon.com/Theology Raw. Really appreciate all of you who are supporting this podcast. It really does make the podcast go round and around. Okay, let's dive in. First question: what habits or traditions did my wife and I have to keep our marriage a priority while raising kids? Any good couples devotionals that you would recommend? Well, let me begin with that second question there. I actually personally don't have any good devotionals that I could recommend. Not that they're not out there. That's just, I know that's helped out many, many couples, devotionals that they go through together. We've tried some in the past. I can't remember which ones, and it just didn't fit my wife and I's vibe, I guess. I don't know. Our routine. So, so unfortunately I don't have any I could recommend you, but I'm sure there's out there, and I'm sure, if you talk to some people, they can recommend some couples devotionals. For us, a big value has been just quality time. And my wife in particular has a really good gauge on whether or not we are getting sufficient quality time as a couple. In some seasons of life, that's been challenging, especially when kids are young and, we're both working a lot, and it can be really, really tough to get quality time. But we've tried hard to make that a high priority. And then other seasons of life, we get too much quality time. Maybe not too much, but we get plenty, So, each couple's different, and I think it's good to recognize the vast array of different personalities, temperament, what constitutes a flourishing relationship. Like, that's different for every person. I guess this is my one big overarching encouragement is don't be putting somebody else's like narrow box of what your marriage routine must look like. Pay attention to your spouse and their needs and your needs as a spouse. And your life-giving routine may be different than somebody else's. Somebody else might do X, Y, and Z. They might swear by it and want you to do it, and you might try that, and you're like, I don't know, it just doesn't really work for us, and that is completely okay. Okay, marriages are beautifully diverse. For us, our marriage is flourishing the best when we are having fun, we are laughing, we are being adventurous. We are not just going through just the routine of life where, you go into work, come home, have dinner, take care of the kids, talk about the kids, go to sleep, wake up, then do it all over again, over and over and over and over. I feel like we both really need, kind of change. We need some adventure. We need to be having fun. And that's like different with the different stages of our marriage. Before we had kids, we were just married 2 years without kids. And, we had and we were very busy and extremely poor. My wife was working full time. I was working part time and also in full time seminary. We were just scraping and trying to pay off school debt. And we just had, was it 2 nickels to rub together, So we would go and find the cheapest restaurant, split a meal, try to go maybe once a week on a Friday night, just to make sure we're spending time together. Then when we had kids, it was just different. And then, childcare is expensive. And so date nights were, a little less common. And now as our kids are older, we have 2 out of the house, 2 in the house. We feel like our kids are they really are our best friends. And I think our kids almost feel the same. Like, we actually really, really enjoy each other. So now it's like my wife and I actually don't go on too many dates by ourselves because we'd much rather be hanging out with the kids and having fun with them. Now, if they're busy or something, my wife and I, we'll go on a date or hang out. But we both work from home. This is kind of going back to every couple's different. Like, we both work from home. So we see each other a lot throughout the day. Sometimes it's business, sometimes it's, just hanging out and having lunch or whatever. But like, we have, we see each other a lot. So the need for like a solo date night, but just by ourselves, it's just, I don't know, just in our current routine isn't as important. So, the one thing, you want to make sure is that you don't want to get to a place to where when your kids are out of the house, you're looking at your spouse and you're like, I don't know you. I don't know if I even like you. All I know about you is you are the parent of our kids. And all I've known of you is as a parent, a fellow co-parent with our kids, but I don't know who you are apart from the kids. That's very, very common. And so I would say you do want to establish patterns in life to where when your kids are out of the house, it's not like so depressing because now you have to just spend time with this one person apart from the kids when that's your whole life has been with the kids. My wife and I talk about this all the time, and we've been married over 23 years, 2 of those without kids, 21 with kids. We hardly know each other apart from the kids somehow being wrapped up into that. So, but one day they're going to be gone. So we need to make sure we're cultivating patterns now to where when they do leave, it's not like so utterly depressing and we have to kind of figure it out all over again. So anyway, I'm not great at giving marriage advice. It's not my forte, but those are my 2 cents. Okay. Next question. Okay. This gets, pretty, well, it's a great question actually. Do I think it's a sin for spouses to have sex when the woman is in her period? And you cross-reference Leviticus 18. If so, how would you engage that convo in the church? That might be the most difficult part of this question. Oh, I can give you an answer here on the podcast, but how do you go about this in the church? Whew, that'd be interesting. I've never seen this addressed in the church. There's 3 passages in the Old Testament, actually, that prohibit sex during menstruation. Leviticus 15:24, 18:19, and 20, verse 18. So all 3 are in Leviticus. Whenever I get is this sin, is it not sin question, especially when we're dealing with something that is only explicitly addressed in the Old Testament, we have to go back to the drawing board and kind of like figure out what is our methodology for even determining what is sin or not. One basic kind of standard one is, well, if it's in the Old Testament and it's also repeated in the New or refuted in the New, then that's a very clear indication whether it could be sin or not sin. Okay, so if it's repeated in the New Testament, then this prohibition would be sin. Or this act would be sin. If it's refuted in the New Testament, then it's no longer sin. So like eating pork, prohibited in the Old, that command is overturned in the New. So now we can say pretty confidently eating bacon is no longer sin. Thank the good Lord for that. But what about when it's something stated in the Old Testament and the New Testament's silent? Which is what we're dealing with here. We have 3 commands in the Old Testament, none in the New. We cannot assume simply because it's in the Old Testament, it's like not for today. That methodology is not, I don't think that's helpful. If it's refuted in the New, then sure, it's not for today. But if it's just not addressed, then we have to roll up our sleeves and do a bit deeper work in the relationship between the covenants, the kind of really robust hermeneutic and the passages we're dealing with. I'm pretty sure that any first century Jewish Christian would say it's sin, because Leviticus 18 was sort of their standard passage on sexual ethics. Like if a first century Jewish Christian said it wasn't sin, then this would be the only one in a context with a whole litany of sexual prohibitions. This would be the only one that is no longer prohibited. I don't think a first century Jewish Christian would just ditch it so quickly. Like, why would they? Plus, the Greek word porneia, as it's used in first century Jewish literature or around that time, it seems to include all of the sins in Leviticus 18. Like Leviticus 18, what is it, verses 6 to 23? This is kind of like the like main passage about sexual ethics, or about, prohibitions, sexual prohibitions for any Jewish person. So, and since we don't have any reason in the New Testament to say this is no longer valid, I think first century Jewish Christians would just assume, like, of course, this is still part of God's moral law. I do think it sounds like I'm saying it is sin, and I'll state my tentative conclusion in a second. But on the flip side, I do think we have to go into and look at the moral logic behind the original command that's tied, that's driving the prohibition to have sex during menstruation. Is it connected with is the moral logic driving this prohibition? Is it connected with the old covenant in a specific way? Because if it's connected with the old covenant, then it dies with the old covenant. If it's connected, if it's something specifically connected with the old covenant, like it's related to Israel, specifically Israel living in the land of Israel under that old covenant, and it's really intrinsically connected to that covenant, then one might be able to argue that maybe this command dies with the old covenant. And some have suggested that this has to do with ritual purity, that during menstruation, the woman is ritually impure, not morally impure. Don't think sin here. It's not like she's in sin because she's menstruating, my Lord. But she is ritually impure. And that whole framework, that's just so foreign to us, that does capture a kind of an ancient Near Eastern perspective on purity and impurity. So one could argue that because it's so connected with ritual purity, and because the new covenant doesn't deal with ritual impurity and purity, that therefore it is no longer valid. Here's my one concern with that, though. Like, Leviticus 15, the very first time we see this prohibition is in Leviticus 15, and that whole chapter is all about ritual purity. Okay, Leviticus 15. It's it's one of the, is that the body fluids passage? So it's not just menstruation; it's several other body fluids that are mentioned there. Or is that Leviticus 11? No, Leviticus 11 is the dietary code, I believe, and I'm pretty sure Leviticus 15 is the bodily fluids passage. So if the only prohibition was in Leviticus 15, I could see a case being made that, okay, this is really wrapped up in the whole purity, impurity, ancient Near East mindset that just doesn't really carry over into the New Testament. However, the prohibition is also mentioned in, as you said, Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. And Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, these are kind of mirror passages, or they're kind of sister passages, and they're part of what's called the Holiness Code, which addresses morality in a more universal way. This is where we get love your neighbor as yourself and many other commands and prohibitions that most Christians would say are still for today, Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20. Because they're no longer are these two passages dealing with like specific, like ritual purity in Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20. This is more social and moral living in general. So all that to say, I lean towards it being sinful. Or at least I would say it goes against God's design for sexual activity. We also, it would be interesting to kind of raise some more natural law or design questions about this. What is going on during menstruation? And could that signal that God did not design the human body to be sexually active during this time? If for anything, I mean, it's a time when you can't really get pregnant, right? I mean, maybe there's some fluke things, but the woman is not if sex is designed to be procreative, I know that's kind of more of a Catholic position, and the body is giving signals that it is not procreative during these few days, then you could argue from a design position that God did not design the human body to be engaging in sexual activity during this time. And, we say, but we really want to, it's well, okay. I don't, that's not really a great moral argument. Yeah. So I guess the burden of proof would rest on somebody to make a case that it is not sinful. Maybe that's where I would land. That's a cautious landing, right? Like, is it sinful or not? I'm like, okay, what's the best argument that it's not sinful? If you say, well, it's only in the Old Testament. Okay, well, that's not enough. Well, it's not hurting anybody and it's consensual. Okay, well, that's a good secular ethic, but that's not necessarily like, doesn't exhaust kind of the moral logic behind biblical sexual ethics. So I lean towards, I don't think that people should be having sex during menstruation. There's actually a decent article by John Piper at desiringgod.com. I think if you just Google, is sex during menstruation sinful? John Piper, if you Google it, should take you there. I think it came out a couple of years ago. He actually does a pretty good job overviewing this issue and digs into some of the ancient background with ritual purity and impurity. It's pretty informative. Okay, next question. Does 2 Timothy 1:18 support praying for the dead or post-mortem salvation? Paul is asking God as if the decision has not been made or the result could be changed. So Paul says, let's just back up to verse 16, 2 Timothy 1:16. May the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus. Is that how you say it? Onesiphorus? Onesiphorus? No, it's Onesiphorus, right? For he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. But when he arrived in Rome, he searched for me earnestly and found me. May the Lord grant him to find mercy from the Lord on that day. And that day is referring to the final day, Judgment Day. And you well know all the service he rendered at Ephesus. So honestly, I think this is just more of a general expression of hope that Onesiphorus will receive a favorable verdict on Judgment Day. But I don't get the sense that Paul thinks this is in doubt. I think he's just it's like a generic hope. Not in that I hope this happens, but like placing hope that this will happen. It's kind of like, if I said, may God be with you. This doesn't mean that I have doubts that God is actually with them. If I'm referring to a Christian, hey, may God be with you. Well, that's just kind of almost like a colloquial way of saying God is with you, and I'm reminding you of that. There's nothing in the context that suggests that Onesiphorus, that his salvation is in any way in doubt. I mean, he's contrasting Onesiphorus with some people where Paul very much thought their salvation is in doubt. But in contrast, here's a guy who's super faithful, not ashamed of my chains, and rendered all kinds of service to me in Ephesus. So, all that to say, I don't think we can squeeze out of this passage some sort of like hope for post-mortem salvation. Another question: why were only certain writings of Paul included in the Bible? The quick answer is we don't know. We just don't know. We do have a few allusions in the New Testament to other writings of Paul. We have 2 other letters to the Corinthian church that are referenced but aren't in the Bible. We have 2, but within those 2 Corinthian letters, we have 2 more letters that Paul references that he wrote to Corinth. We also have in Colossians 4:16 a reference to a letter from Laodicea that seems to be he's telling the Colossians, make sure you also read the letter from Laodicea. And most people say that this is, referencing a letter that Paul wrote to Laodicea, which is just kind of up the road from Colossae. And we don't have that letter. So, the short answer is we just don't know. I mean, Paul's a skilled letter writer, right? I mean, he's a very He didn't just
Hey friends, I hope you enjoyed this portion of the Patreon-only Q&A podcast. If you would like to listen to the full-length episode and receive other bonus content like monthly podcasts, opportunities to ask questions, access to first drafts of my research, and monthly Zoom chats and more, then please head over to patreon.com/theology in the raw to join Theology in the Raw's Patreon community. That's patreon.com/theology in the raw.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.